2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
It's always great to have Associate Professor Jim Joes from the Newcastle Business School, University of Newcastle, with us this morning. Jim, good morning.
Morning, Todd.
I'm never surprised at the world of politics, but so much money goes into determining who is going to win a seat or who's going to win this or who's going to win that. But I was really interested in the fact to find out two ping pong balls drawn from a bucket have decided the fate of a councillor in north-western Queensland after it had a dead heat. What are the chances of that, getting a dead heat, but I suppose in a smaller area? So they realised that the only thing they could do was just stick two ping pong balls in the bucket, and the winner was decided that way. What a bizarre way to sort that out.
Yes, it was certainly an interesting outcome, the way in which they solved it. But it was, in effect, going back to the ancient Greek democracy of drawing lots.
Yeah, stones in a jar.
Yes, and what the remarkable thing, I think, and one of the interesting things, Todd, is that once the draw is made, the loser abides by the decision, and that's a mark, I think, of an effectively functioning democracy. And perhaps some of our former political party leaders might take a message from that about stepping back after they've lost.
We could save a huge amount of money by just making it the ping pong ball election, couldn't we? That'd be fantastic. Bit like Lotto, really. They could do it that way.
The two-up election.
Yeah, hey, strange but true. All right, it made a lot of news last week across the weekend. My ears pricked up when I heard about it, but Treasurer Scott Morrison has come out yesterday and said the intense income tax debate, which came and went within basically a few days, was just a bit of a bluff. Of course, what he was talking about, and the PM was talking about, was the possibility if the states wanted more money, then they could contribute by raising some income tax, and the states decided they weren't going to be a part of that. He said it was a huge bluff, and the PM came out and said the states need to live within their means. So it was just a big waste of a couple of days, really, wasn't it?
Well, I think calling it a bluff is trying to put a positive spin on a disastrous and ill-thought-out feint, if you like, a move by the government to try and take control of the policy agenda and set the running. Unfortunately, they moved in a direction that was not particularly effective. If we, in a way which is probably perhaps disingenuous, because when the federal government took control after a referendum on income tax and became the sole collector of income tax back in the 40s, the idea was to provide a better way of making sure the states got a fair share of the national funding and so forth. Unfortunately, in distributing the income tax, it's sort of based on how much you raise and where you raise it from, and the smaller states missed out. So we had a bit of a problem, and it has been an ongoing problem for most of Federation. During the Fraser years in the 70s, Malcolm Fraser sort of floated the idea that the states were still able to raise income tax if they so chose, or they could raise sales taxes of their own devices if they so chose.
The list goes on and on and on.
But no state was going to do that and get involved in double taxing as far as the wage earners were concerned. So then we fast forward to the GST, and the GST was going to solve these problems about state funding, because the GST would raise enough money for all the states to get what they needed to run their operations.
Well, it was marketed as a panacea, wasn't it? It's like, oh, here we go, yes, everything is going to be okay now.
However, and you then have to factor in the fact that the federal government begins cutting back in this area or that area, and the states are left holding the bag. From the states' perspective, they're in a no-win position, because they can't raise the money without coming under some degree of attack from their voters, and if they don't do something about it, they then don't have the funds to do what they need to do to manage health and education and so forth. The federal government says, well, this is your problem, live within your means. But the fact remains that the states have never had, shall we say, sufficient means for them to actually stay within.
To raise the funds they need to keep the state running on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, and because most of the services that most people have to make use of, be it health, transport, education and so forth, they're basically funded by the states. The federal government supports from a distance and helps the states meet some of these needs, and with its particular ways of funding, puts the states under various constraints. They can do this or that, but they can't do something else. And if we just look at education very, very quickly, the federal government provides, a big whack of money to help the states with education, but nearly half of that money from the federal government goes to private schools. So the state schools, shall we say, the schools funded by the state, don't get as much, perhaps, as they deserve.
And that's a prickly topic all on its own.
Of course it is. It's a very thorny topic. But, I think the federal government currently has been a little disingenuous when they've turned around and said, well, the states have got to be like, they've got to become adults and look after their own money and stop coming to us. But a year and a half ago, they knocked off $80 billion out of the state, going to the states, and then said to the states, well, you've got to make up the shortfall, and the states don't have the capacity. Okay, well, raise some taxes, raise income taxes.
The thing is, it always seems to be the way when it comes to a government anywhere around the world. If you've got a problem, tax the people more, but it never seems, it's never popular, and it's never ever going to be popular, and it never fixes the problem.
Well, that's true, and I think we need to sort of step back a bit as well, that the federal government over a number of years, both Labor and Liberal, but particularly during the Howard years, began reducing levels of personal income tax as ways of buying votes, basically. Mm-hmm. And, of course, as you do that, as you lower it, you also lower your revenue. Now, that's fine when you've got other sources of revenue coming in, as it was during the mining boom. But once the mining boom stops, once other sorts of sources of income start to dry up, then the fact that you've lowered income taxes to keep yourself in government means that you don't have the flexibility. And then you've got to face the prospect of raising income taxes. Well, there are probably other solutions as well, and we're running out of time to deal with them.
That's
but
right.
I think that very quickly, the federal government, and particularly the Turnbull government this time around, was it a bluff? Well, I think it was an ill-thought-out
policy on the run,
and they've had a number of them in the past couple of weeks, and they actually need to start thinking about where they're going, because the polls are now starting to say, "Hey, we're losing faith."
Yeah, absolutely, and it would be very, very worrying for Malcolm Turnbull at the moment, because the polls aren't looking great. As they always say, the only poll that matters is election day.
And for the Labor Party, maybe it's slow and steady wins the race. The tortoise and the hare.
We will have to keep an eye on it. So there you go, the big bluff. It's 28 after 9.